The morning sun streamed through the large airport windows as 16-year-old twins Zion and Zara Wilson rolled their carry-on bags toward the check-in counter. This was their first time flying alone, without their parents, and they felt both nervous and excited. Their grandparents were waiting for them in Atlanta, and the twins couldn't wait to spend their summer break away from the hustle of New York City. "You got the tickets?" Zara asked her brother, tugging at the strings of her navy blue hoodie. She wore it with simple jeans and white sneakers, comfortable for the 4-hour flight ahead. Zion patted the pocket of his black hoodie and nodded. "Right here. Dad checked us in online last night, but he said we still need to show them at security." The twins approached the premium check-in counter where a friendly agent greeted them with a smile. "Good morning, how can I help you today?" "We're flying to Atlanta," Zion said, sliding their digital boarding passes and ID cards across the counter. "First class." The agent's eyebrows rose slightly as she looked at the teenagers dressed in casual clothes, but her smile never faltered as she checked their information. "Everything looks good. Your flight departs from gate C-15 in 2 hours. You'll have access to the Sky Lounge if you'd like to wait there before boarding." "Thanks," Zara said, taking back their IDs. As they walked away, Zion nudged his sister. "Did you see her face when I said first class?" Zara rolled her eyes. "I saw. Same old story." The twins had grown used to the looks of surprise or disbelief whenever they mentioned flying first class. Their father always booked them premium seats when they flew, but rarely did anyone believe the 2 black teenagers belonged in that section until they showed their tickets. "Dad said not to let it bother us," Zion reminded her as they headed toward security. After clearing the TSA checkpoint, they decided to skip the lounge and explore the airport shops instead. They bought snacks, browsed through books, and tried on silly souvenir hats, taking selfies to send to their parents. "Mom's gonna love this one," Zara laughed, showing Zion a picture of herself wearing an oversized Statue of Liberty crown. Time passed quickly, and soon the boarding announcement for their flight echoed through the terminal. The twins gathered their things and headed to gate C-15, where passengers were already lining up. "First-class passengers may now board," announced the gate agent. Zion and Zara moved toward the priority line, boarding passes ready on their phones. That's when they noticed her. A flight attendant with platinum blonde hair pulled into a tight bun, scanning passengers with sharp eyes as they approached. Her name tag read, Ms. Reynolds. As the twins stepped into the first-class line, Ms. Reynolds quickly moved to intercept them. "Excuse me," she said, her voice polite, but firm. "This line is for first-class passengers only. General boarding will begin shortly." "We have first-class tickets," Zara explained, turning her phone screen toward the flight attendant. Ms. Reynolds barely glanced at the screen. "I think there must be some mistake. This is the premium boarding line." She gestured toward the regular boarding area. "Your line is over there." Zion stepped forward. "No mistake. We're in first class, seats 2A and 2B. He tried again to show his boarding pass. The flight attendant's smile tightened. "Young man, I've been working this route for 15 years. I know what first-class tickets look like, and I know who usually holds them." Her eyes flicked from Zion's hoodie to Zara's sneakers. "Now please move aside and let the actual first-class passengers board." Several well-dressed business travelers behind them shifted uncomfortably. A few exchanged glances, but no one spoke. But, Zion began. "Is there a problem here?" Another flight attendant approached, a younger man with kind eyes. "Just directing these young people to the correct line, Alex," Ms. Reynolds said. "They seem confused about their seating assignment." "We're not confused," Zara said, her voice steady despite the anger and embarrassment warming her cheeks. "We have first-class tickets that our dad bought for us." Alex reached for Zion's phone. "May I?" he asked, much more respectfully than his colleague had. Zion handed it over. Alex studied the boarding pass and nodded. "These are indeed first-class tickets." Ms. Reynolds frowned. "There must be some mistake in the system." "No mistake," Alex confirmed, returning Zion's phone. "Their tickets are valid." Ms. Reynolds wasn't convinced. "Even so, I need to check with the gate manager. We've had issues with upgrade glitches recently." She turned to the twins. "Wait here, please. As she walked away, Zara whispered to her brother, "Should we call Dad?" Zion nodded, already pulling out his phone. Their father had warned them they might face situations like this and told them to call him immediately if anyone gave them trouble. While they waited, more first-class passengers arrived, forcing the twins to step aside. Some gave them curious looks while others simply ignored them, assuming they didn't belong. Alex, the friendlier flight attendant, approached them again. "I'm sorry about this. Ms. Reynolds is very particular about procedure." "It's okay," Zion said, though it wasn't. "Our dad's on the phone now." On the other end of the line, their father listened as Zion explained the situation. Unlike his children, who remained calm and composed, Thomas Wilson felt his blood pressure rising with every word. This wasn't the first time his children had faced discrimination, but he had hoped that the tickets he'd purchased, tickets that cost more than most people's monthly rent, would at least guarantee them respectful treatment. "Put me on speaker," he told his son. Zion held the phone out so both he and Zara could hear. "Are you both okay?" their father asked, his deep voice coming through clearly. "We're fine, Dad," Zara answered. "Just embarrassed." "Don't be. You've done nothing wrong," Thomas assured them. "Is the flight attendant still there?" "No, she went to check with someone," Zion explained. "But there's another flight attendant who confirmed our tickets are good." "I see." Their father paused. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Don't board until I arrive." "But Dad, you'll have to go through security and everything," Zara protested. "The flight leaves in 45 minutes. "I'll be there," Thomas repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "If anyone asks, tell them your father is coming to resolve the issue. If they try to make you board or move you to different seats, refuse politely, understand?" The twins nodded, then remembered he couldn't see them. "Yes, Dad," they said in unison. "Good. Stay on the line with me while I drive." Thomas Wilson didn't speed, but he drove with purpose, taking the quickest route to the airport. As CEO of Summit Airlines, one of the country's fastest-growing carriers, he could have called ahead and had someone deal with the situation. But this was personal. His children were being disrespected, and he wanted to handle it himself. Meanwhile, at the gate, Ms. Reynolds returned with the gate manager, a nervous-looking man who kept checking his tablet. "There seems to be some confusion," the manager began, addressing the twins. "Your tickets do show first-class seats, but—" "There's no confusion," Zara interrupted politely. "Our father purchased these tickets for us." "And where is your father?" Ms. Reynolds asked, her tone suggesting she didn't believe they had one. "He's on his way," Zion answered, holding up the phone still connected to their call. "He asked us to wait for him before boarding." The gate manager looked alarmed. "The flight is scheduled to depart in 40 minutes. We can't hold the plane. For a parent who isn't even through security yet." "You won't have to," came Thomas's voice from the phone speaker. "I'll be there in 10 minutes, and I suggest you hold those seats for my children as their tickets indicate, or there will be serious consequences." Ms. Reynolds leaned toward the phone. "Sir, I don't respond well to threats. If your children can't board now, we'll have to reassign their seats." "That wasn't a threat, ma'am," Thomas replied calmly. "It was a promise, and I always keep my promises." The call ended, leaving an uncomfortable silence. The gate manager fidgeted with his tablet while Ms. Reynolds crossed, her arms, her lips pressed into a thin line. Alex, the other flight attendant, wisely kept his distance but remained watchful. The last of the first-class passengers had boarded, and now the gate agent was calling for priority boarding groups. Zion and Zara stood to the side, ignored by Ms. Reynolds but given sympathetic glances by Alex. "We should just go find other seats," Zara whispered to her brother. "This is getting too messy." Zion shook his head. "Dad said to wait, so we wait." The minutes ticked by, and more passengers filed onto the plane. The twins knew their father would arrive soon, but they also knew he'd have to get through security first. Would he make it in time? And what would happen when he did? Thomas Wilson gripped the steering wheel tightly as he drove toward the airport. The call with his children had ended, but their voices still echoed in his mind. The familiar mix of anger and sadness washed over him, emotions he'd felt too many times before when his children faced discrimination. At 45, Thomas had built Summit Airlines from nothing into one of the country's most successful carriers. His journey had been anything but easy. 23 years ago, he was just a baggage handler at Kennedy Airport, working double shifts to put himself through night school. He remembered the weight of those bags, the ache in his back after 12-hour days, and the skeptical looks from passengers who rarely made eye contact with him. "Watch where you're going with that," a first-class passenger had snapped at him once when Thomas accidentally brushed against his expensive coat with a luggage cart. "Sorry, sir," Thomas had replied automatically, though the contact had been so light it couldn't have possibly damaged anything. The passenger had looked him up and down with disdain. "People like you should be more careful around people like me." Those words had stuck with Thomas through the years. People like you. He knew exactly what the man had meant. As Thomas pulled into the airport parking garage, finding a spot in the short-term section, those memories fueled his determination. His children would never be made to feel less than, not if he could help it. He had met his wife Denise during his second year working at the airport. She was a flight attendant with dreams of becoming a pilot. They'd connected over airport, coffee during her layovers, talking for hours about their shared love of aviation and their hopes for the future. "I want to start my own airline someday," he'd told her on their third date, half expecting her to laugh. Instead, she'd nodded thoughtfully. What would make it different from all the others? That question had sparked a conversation that lasted until dawn, as they outlined plans for an airline that would prioritize both customer experience and employee well-being, something neither of them had seen in the industry. Thomas rushed through the airport now, using his industry credentials to access an expedited security line. As he moved, he reflected on how far they'd come. After years of saving, night classes, and climbing through various positions in the industry, Thomas and Denise had taken a massive risk. They'd pooled their life savings, secured loans, and launched Summit Airlines with just 2 leased planes and routes between 4 cities. The early years had been brutal. Competing against established carriers meant cutting their profit margins razor thin. They'd remortgaged their house twice. There were months when they could barely make payroll, when Thomas would lie awake at night wondering if he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. But they'd persevered. Their attention to customer service and employee satisfaction had slowly built them a loyal following. When larger airlines cut corners during economic downturns, Summit held firm to its principles, earning respect from travelers and industry insiders alike. By the time the twins were born, a joyous surprise that doubled their expected family size overnight. Summit was operating in 12 cities with a fleet of 15 aircraft. Thomas and Denise had agreed that despite their growing success, they wanted to raise their children with humility and perspective. "Success doesn't make us better than anyone else," Denise would often remind the twins. "It just gives us more responsibility to do good." As Thomas hurried through the terminal toward Gate C-15, he thought about how they'd deliberately kept the twins out of the spotlight. Unlike some of their wealthy peers, Zion and Zara didn't have social media profiles showcasing lavish lifestyles. They attended a good but not extravagant private school, wore normal teenage clothes, and were expected to work summer jobs like any other kids their age. Few people outside the industry knew that Thomas Wilson owned Summit Airlines. He preferred it that way, working from a modest office and focusing on operations rather than being the public face of the company. His executive team handled most media appearances, allowing him to concentrate on what mattered most: running a good airline and raising good kids. The twins had grown up understanding both privilege and prejudice. Thomas and Denise had never sheltered them from the realities of being black in America. They'd had the talk with their children early, explaining how some people might treat them differently because of their skin color, regardless of their character or achievements. "You'll have to work twice as hard for half the recognition," Thomas had told them. "It's not fair, but it's reality." At the same time, they'd instilled in the twins a fierce sense of self-worth that couldn't be diminished by others' ignorance. Zion and Zara knew their value didn't come from external validation or material possessions. As Thomas approached gate C-15, he spotted his children standing off to the side while passengers continued to board. His heart swelled with pride seeing how composed they remained despite the unfair treatment. Many teenagers would have caused a scene by now, but his kids stood tall and dignified, exactly as he and Denise had raised them to be. The irony wasn't lost on Thomas that this incident was happening on a Summit Airlines partner flight. His company had a code-share agreement with several other carriers, including this one. Passengers could book through Summit but fly on partner airlines, which was what he'd done for the twins' trip to visit their grandparents. He'd chosen this particular flight because it was direct, not thinking about how staff who weren't trained under Summit's strict diversity and inclusion policies might treat his children. That had been an oversight he now regretted. Taking a deep breath to calm himself, Thomas approached the gate. He didn't want to embarrass his children with an emotional outburst, no matter how justified his anger might be. This was a teaching moment, for the airline staff, yes, but also for Zion and Zara, who were watching to see how their father would handle the situation. The gate area was still busy with late boarding passengers when Thomas reached his children. Zara spotted him first, relief washing over her face. "Dad," she called, waving him over. Thomas embraced both his children quickly, looking them over as if checking for injuries, though he knew the only wounds here were invisible ones. "Are you both okay?" he asked quietly. Zion nodded. "We're fine. Just ready to get on the plane." "I'll handle this," Thomas assured them, turning toward the gate desk where the manager was supervising the final boarding calls. The flight attendant who had confronted his children, Ms. Reynolds, according to her name tag, stood nearby watching the last group of passengers scan their boarding passes. She hadn't noticed Thomas yet. Thomas didn't immediately identify himself as the airline's owner. Over the years, he'd learned that revealing his position too early often prevented him from seeing how his staff genuinely behaved. If he wanted to understand the true nature of the problem, he needed to approach this first as a father, not as a CEO. "Excuse me," he said to the gate manager. "I'm Thomas Wilson, Zion and Zara's father. There seems to be some confusion about their seating assignments." The manager's eyes widened slightly in recognition, not of Thomas's name, but of the situation. "Mr. Wilson, yes. Your children mentioned you were coming. I'm Dale Porter, the gate manager. We're nearly finished with boarding and I'm afraid my children have confirmed first-class seats," Thomas interrupted calmly. "Is there a reason they weren't allowed to board with the other first-class passengers?" Ms. Reynolds stepped forward, her professional smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Sir, there was some confusion about their tickets. We needed to verify." "What confusion exactly?" Thomas asked. "Their boarding passes clearly show first-class seats. What needed verification?" The flight attendant hesitated, and in that pause, Thomas saw the truth. There had been no legitimate reason to question his children's tickets. Nothing needed verification except, perhaps, whether two black teenagers belonged in first class. Dale, the gate manager, jumped in. "It's company policy to verify certain tickets, Mr. Wilson, especially with unaccompanied minors." "Is it also company policy to direct passengers to the correct line without even looking at their boarding passes?" Thomas asked, referencing what his children had told him. "Because that's what my kids say happened." Ms. Reynolds flushed slightly. "I was simply trying to direct traffic efficiently. It was a misunderstanding." Thomas nodded slowly. "I see. Well, now that I'm here and there's no more misunderstanding, my children should be able to board and take their assigned seats, correct?" "Of course," Dale said quickly. "We'll escort them on board right away. I'll be joining them to their seats," Thomas added, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. Dale hesitated. "Sir, you don't have a boarding pass." Thomas smiled thinly. "I believe you can arrange a gate pass for me to escort my minor children to their seats. It's a common practice for parents of unaccompanied minors, isn't it?" Before Dale could respond, another staff member approached, the younger flight attendant who had initially confirmed the twins' tickets. He leaned in and whispered something to Dale, whose expression changed dramatically. "Mr. Wilson, Dale said, his voice now trembling, slightly. I didn't realize, that is, we didn't know who you. Please allow me to personally escort you and your children on board. Thomas realized the younger flight attendant had recognized him, probably from company materials or industry events. His cover was blown. Ms. Reynolds looked confused by the sudden change in Dale's demeanor. Is there something I should know? She asked. Dale cleared his throat. Ms. Reynolds, this is Thomas Wilson. When she showed no sign of recognition, he added with emphasis, CEO and founder of Summit Airlines, our partner carrier. The color drained from Ms. Reynolds' face as the implication sank in. Thomas Wilson wasn't just any concerned parent coming to advocate for his children. He was essentially her boss's boss, as Summit's partnership was crucial to their airline's East Coast operations. Mr. Wilson, she stammered, I had no idea. Please accept my apologies for any misunderstanding. Thomas regarded her calmly. Let's make sure my children get to their seats. We can discuss misunderstandings afterward. As they moved toward the jetway, Thomas placed a protective hand on each of his children's shoulders. He felt Zara lean slightly into his touch and saw Zion stand a little straighter. They'd been through situations like this before, though perhaps not quite so public. Thomas knew that what would happen next would teach his children an important lesson, not just about handling discrimination, but about using power responsibly. How he responded in the next few minutes would show them more about his character and values than any lecture ever could, and he was determined to make it count. The narrow jetway seemed to stretch endlessly as Thomas and his children followed. Dale Porter toward the aircraft. Ms. Reynolds walked stiffly ahead of them, her back ramrod straight, while the younger flight attendant, Alex, brought up the rear. The tension in the air was thick enough to touch. Thomas could feel his children watching him, gauging his reaction. Throughout their lives, he had taught them to handle discrimination with dignity. Your response defines you more than their actions. Define them, he often said. Now was his chance to demonstrate that principle in action. As they reached the aircraft door, Ms. Reynolds turned to face them. Her professional smile was back in place, though it looked more strained than before. Welcome aboard, she said, her voice artificially bright. Mr. Wilson, if you'd like to see your children to their seats, I'd be happy to escort you personally. Thomas nodded without returning her smile. Thank you. The first-class cabin was nearly full. Curious eyes turned to watch as the unusual procession made its way down the aisle. The flight attendant, followed by the twins and their father, plus the gate manager and another flight attendant. It wasn't the typical boarding scene. Here we are, Ms. Reynolds announced, stopping at row 2. 2A and 2B. A middle-aged white couple was already seated in the row, looking up in confusion. There seems to be another mix-up, Ms. Reynolds said, checking the seat numbers. These seats are occupied. Thomas remained calm. Please check who's assigned to these seats. Dale quickly pulled out his tablet and tapped the screen several times. Oh dear, he said, looking embarrassed. It appears these passengers were upgraded just minutes ago when we thought the seats might become available. Thomas understood immediately. When the twins were prevented from boarding with the other first-class passengers, the airline had given away their seats, assuming they wouldn't be used. I see, Thomas said, his voice dangerously quiet. And where exactly were you planning to seat my children when they eventually boarded? Dale shifted uncomfortably. We were going to offer them premium economy as a courtesy. A courtesy, Thomas repeated. You mean after denying them the first-class seats they had valid tickets for, you were going to graciously offer them lesser seats as a favor? The couple in row 2 exchanged uncomfortable glances. The woman leaned toward her partner and whispered, Something. He nodded and raised his hand. Excuse me, the man said. We're happy to move if there's been a mistake. We were just told there was a complimentary upgrade available. Thomas appreciated the man's reasonable attitude. Thank you, but that won't be necessary. The airline will find appropriate accommodations for my children without displacing other passengers. He turned to Dale. I assume there are 2 other first-class seats available? Dale consulted his tablet again. Yes, 4C and 4D are open. They're in the center, not by the window, but... That's fine, Thomas cut in. Zion, Zara, go ahead and take those seats. I need to have a word with Mr. Porter and Miss Reynolds before I leave." The twins hesitated, exchanging a look that Thomas recognized. They were worried about what would happen after they left his side. "It's okay," he assured them. "I'll be right there." Reluctantly, they moved toward their new seats. Thomas watched until they were settled, then turned his attention back to the airline staff. "Is there somewhere we can speak privately?" he asked. Dale nodded quickly. "We can use the galley area." The cramped galley barely fit the 4 adults, Thomas, Dale, Ms. Reynolds, and Alex, who had followed them, perhaps sensing he might be needed. Thomas waited until the other flight attendants had discreetly moved to different parts of the aircraft before speaking. "I want to be very clear about what happened here today," he began, his voice low but intense. "My children, who are minors, traveling alone, were singled out and prevented from boarding in their ticketed class because of how they look. When they produced valid boarding passes, they were still denied and told to wait. Then, while they were waiting, their seats were given away." Dale started to speak, but Thomas held up a hand to stop him. "I'm not finished. What happened here goes beyond poor customer service. It's discrimination, plain and simple." Ms. Reynolds stiffened. "Mr. Wilson, I assure you this had nothing to do with—" "Please don't insult my intelligence," Thomas interrupted. "My children were wearing hoodies and jeans. If they'd been white kids in the same clothes, would you have stopped them from boarding first class?" The silence that followed was answer enough. "I didn't think so," Thomas continued. "Now here's what's going to happen. My children will fly today in first class, as their tickets entitle them to. When this flight lands, I want a full incident. Report from both of you detailing exactly what occurred and why." Dale nodded nervously. "Of course, Mr. Wilson. And please accept our deepest apologies for this unfortunate—" "I'm not interested in apologies right now," Thomas said. "I'm interested in accountability and change. As you know, Summit Airlines has a partnership agreement with your carrier. That agreement includes strict standards for how passengers are treated." He looked directly at Ms. Reynolds. "You failed to meet those standards today, and before you assume this is about your job, let me be clear. I'm not interested in getting anyone fired. That solves nothing. What I want is to address the underlying problem." Ms. Reynolds looked surprised. She had clearly been expecting Thomas to demand her termination. Her shoulders relaxed slightly, though wariness remained in her eyes. "The underlying problem, Ms. Reynolds, is bias," Thomas continued. "We all have biases. The question is whether we recognize them and work to overcome them, or whether we let them control our actions and hurt other people." Alex, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "Sir, if I may, I think part of the issue is that we don't have adequate training on recognizing these biases. Our diversity training is just a 1-hour video we watched during orientation." Thomas nodded appreciatively at the young man's insight. "That's exactly the kind of systemic issue I'm talking about. Individual actions matter, but they happen within a system that either encourages or discourages certain behaviors." He turned back to Dale. "I want a meeting with your airline's head of training and development next week. Summit will be revising our partnership requirements to include more robust diversity and inclusion standards, and I want both of you there," he added, looking between Dale and Ms. Reynolds. Ms. Reynolds frowned. "Both of us? You still want me involved after this?" "Especially you," Thomas said. "People who've never had to confront their biases aren't usually the best at teaching others how to recognize them. But someone who's had to face that difficult truth, they often become the most effective advocates for change." The overhead speaker crackled to life, announcing that the door was closing and all non-passengers needed to deplane immediately. "I need to go," Thomas said. "But this conversation isn't over. It's just beginning." As he turned to leave, Ms. Reynolds called after him, "Mr. Wilson?" He paused, looking back at her. "Your children," she began, then stopped, seeming to search for the right words. "They were very polite, very mature, even when I didn't treat them fairly." Thomas felt a surge of pride. "They've had practice," he said simply, the weight of that statement hanging in the air as he walked away. Moving down the aisle to where his children were seated, Thomas saw that they had already buckled in. Zara was flipping through the in-flight magazine while Zion was adjusting his headphones. They looked up as he approached. "Everything okay, Dad?" Zion asked. Thomas smiled at his son. "Yes, everything's being handled." "Are you going to get that flight attendant fired?" Zara asked, her voice quiet enough that nearby passengers couldn't hear. Thomas shook his head. "No, that wouldn't solve the real problem." "But she was wrong," Zion protested. "She treated us like we didn't belong here." "She was wrong," Thomas agreed. "But firing her would just mean she'd go work somewhere else with the same biases. I'd rather see if she can learn from this and help prevent it from happening to someone else." The final boarding call came over the speaker, and Thomas knew he had to leave. He leaned down between their seats. "I'm proud of you both," he said. "You handled yourselves with dignity. Remember what Mom and I always tell you? Our worth isn't determined by how others treat us." The twins recited together, a familiar family mantra. Thomas smiled. "Exactly, call me when you land, okay? And don't give your grandparents too much trouble." "We won't," Zara promised. Thomas gave each of them a quick hug before heading toward the exit. As he passed row 2, the couple who had been given his children's original seats caught his attention. "Sir?" the woman called softly. Thomas paused. "We overheard some of what happened," she said. "We didn't know those seats weren't supposed to be ours. If we'd known..." "It's not your fault," Thomas assured her. "You didn't do anything wrong." The woman nodded, then added, "Your children seem wonderful. You must be very proud." "I am," Thomas said, feeling a lump form in his throat. "Thank you." As he made his way off the plane, Thomas noticed Ms. Reynolds standing near the door, avoiding eye contact. The younger flight attendant, Alex, stood nearby, watching the interaction cautiously. Thomas stopped in front of Ms. Reynolds. "I meant what I said earlier. This isn't about punishment, it's about growth." She looked up, surprise evident on her face. "Most people in your position would have demanded my job." "I'm not most people," Thomas replied. "And firing you wouldn't change anything. The next person might just be better at hiding their biases." He handed her his business card. "My assistant will be in touch about that meeting. I expect you to be there." Ms. Reynolds took the card, studying it for a moment before nodding. "I will be." As Thomas finally exited the aircraft, he felt the weight of the day's events settling. On his shoulders, he was exhausted, not just physically but emotionally. Confronting discrimination was never easy, especially when it affected his children. Walking back through the terminal, Thomas pulled out his phone to call his wife. Denise would want to know what had happened and how the kids were doing. As the Yaya, CEO's wife and a former flight attendant herself, she had valuable insights into airline operations and had helped shape Summit's inclusive policies. "They're on their way," Thomas told her after explaining the situation. "I think they're okay, but you know how they downplay these things." "Just like their father," Denise replied, a hint of affection in her voice despite her concern. "Always," putting on a brave face. Thomas smiled, feeling some of the tension leave his body at the sound of her voice. "I've set up a meeting for next week with their training department. I think we need to revisit all our partnership agreements and strengthen the inclusion requirements." "Good," Denise said firmly. "And how are you doing?" "Really?" Thomas sighed, finding a quiet corner of the terminal to continue their conversation. "Tired of fighting the same battles. Angry that our kids have to deal with this. Proud of how they handled it." "All valid feelings," Denise assured him. "What did you do about the flight attendant?" "Something unexpected," Thomas admitted. "I'm giving her a chance to be part of the solution." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "That's why I love you," Denise finally said. "Anyone else would have fired her on the spot." "That would have been easier," Thomas acknowledged, "but easier isn't always better." As he made his way to the parking garage, Thomas reflected on the day's events. The incident had been painful, especially for his children, but perhaps some good would come from it. Perhaps Ms. Reynolds would indeed learn and grow. Perhaps the airline would improve its training. Perhaps the next black teenagers to board in first class wouldn't be questioned or redirected or made to feel they didn't belong. It was a lot of perhaps, but change always started that way, with possibility, with hope. And Thomas had always been a hopeful man. It was how he'd built an airline from nothing, and how he'd continue to build a better world for his children, one difficult conversation at a time. The week after the airport incident passed, in a blur for Thomas. Between running Summit Airlines and checking in regularly with the twins during their stay at their grandparents' home, he barely had time to prepare for the meeting he'd demanded with the partner airlines training team. 30 Meeting was scheduled for Friday afternoon at the partner airlines headquarters. As Thomas rode the elevator to the 14th floor, he reviewed his notes one final time. He wasn't just coming as an angry father or even as the CEO of a partner company. He was coming with a proposal for meaningful change. The conference room was already full when he arrived. A long table dominated the space, surrounded by nervous-looking executives in formal business attire. Thomas spotted Ms. Reynolds immediately. She sat near the end of the table, looking uncomfortable in her uniform. The younger flight attendant, Alex, sat beside her, offering a small smile when he caught Thomas's eye. Mr. Wilson, a tall woman, greeted him, extending her hand. "I'm Patricia Clark, Chief Operating Officer. Thank you for coming today." Thomas shook her hand firmly. "Thank you for arranging this meeting on such short notice." "Of course," Patricia replied. "When a valued partner raises concerns about customer experience, we listen." She gestured toward the head of the table. "Please have a seat. We're eager to hear your thoughts." Thomas took his place, setting down his leather portfolio. He looked around the room, taking in the faces watching him. Most were white, he noted. Only 2 of the 12 executives present were people of color. It wasn't surprising, but it was telling. "Before we begin," Patricia said, "I want to assure you that we take what happened to your children very seriously. We've reviewed the incident. Reports and disciplinary actions." Thomas held up a hand. "If I may, Ms. Clark, I'd like to make something clear from the start. I didn't come here seeking punishment for anyone." A ripple of surprise passed through the room. Ms. Reynolds, in particular, looked up sharply. "I came here because what happened to my children happens to black travelers every day," Thomas continued. "And firing one flight attendant won't change that. What will change it is addressing the systemic issues that allowed it to happen in the first place." Patricia nodded slowly. "We're certainly open to hearing your perspective on those issues." "Good," Thomas said, opening his portfolio. "Because I've prepared some recommendations based on the practices we've implemented at Summit Airlines." For the next 20 minutes, Thomas outlined his proposals. He suggested comprehensive bias training for all customer-facing staff, regular, scenario-based refresher courses, clear reporting protocols for incidents of discrimination, and accountability metrics tied to management bonuses. He emphasized that these weren't just feel-good measures, but practices that had improved customer satisfaction and employee retention at Summit. As he spoke, he noticed the executives taking notes, some nodding thoughtfully. Ms. Reynolds, however, remained expressionless, her eyes fixed on the table in front of her. When Thomas finished, Patricia leaned forward. "These are excellent recommendations, Mr. Wilson. We'll certainly take them under advisement." "Under advisement," Thomas repeated. "With all due respect, Ms. Clark, taking things under advisement is corporate speak for we'll think about it, and probably do nothing." "I was hoping for a more concrete commitment." A heavy silence fell over the room. One of the executives cleared his throat. "Mr. Wilson, implementing such extensive changes would require significant resources. In the current economic climate," Thomas interrupted. "You can't afford not to make these changes. Do you know what discrimination cost your airline? Not just in potential lawsuits, but in lost business from travelers who don't return after being treated poorly?" He pulled out a document and slid it across the table. "This is an analysis my team prepared. It shows the financial impact of poor customer experiences related to bias. The numbers are conservative, but they're still substantial." The executives, exchanged glances as the document made its way around the table. Thomas knew he had their attention now. Nothing spoke louder in corporate America than the bottom line. "I'd like to speak if I may," a quiet voice said. All heads turned toward Ms. Reynolds. She sat straighter now, though her hands trembled slightly. Patricia hesitated, then nodded. "Go ahead, Linda." Ms. Reynolds took a deep breath. "I've been a flight attendant for 22 years. I've worked through 9/11, economic downturns, a pandemic. I've seen this industry change in ways I never imagined." She paused. "But some things haven't changed enough, including me." The room was silent as she continued. "When I saw those kids in their hoodies and jeans, I made assumptions. I didn't even look at their tickets before redirecting them. I decided they didn't belong in first class." Her voice wavered. "And the worst part is I didn't even realize what I was doing. It felt like I was just doing my job efficiently." Thomas watched her carefully, surprised by her candor. "Since that day, I haven't been able to stop thinking about it," Ms. Reynolds admitted. "About how many other passengers I might have treated differently based on how they looked. About what that says about me as a person." She looked directly at Thomas. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Mr. Wilson, but I am asking for a chance to be part of the solution." Thomas nodded, respecting her honesty. "That's why I wanted you at this meeting. Real change doesn't come from pretending biases don't exist. It comes from acknowledging them and actively working to overcome them." Alex, the younger flight attendant, spoke up next. "I think Ms. Reynolds is right, and I think we need more than just training videos that people click through to check a box. We need real conversations like this one." Patricia looked thoughtful. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "A pilot program," Alex said, growing more confident. "Using Mr. Wilson's recommendations as a starting point. We could implement them with one flight crew, measure the results, and then expand if they're positive." "And I'd like to volunteer my crew," Ms. Reynolds added, surprising everyone again. "We should be the test case. We've already seen what happens when these issues aren't addressed." Thomas couldn't hide his surprise. This was more than he'd expected. Not just grudging acceptance of his proposals, but actual enthusiasm from the person who had been at the center of the incident. Patricia turned to the executive who had raised concerns about resources. "Jim, what do you think? Could we fund a pilot program?" The man hesitated, then nodded. "For one crew, yes. We could redirect some funds from the customer satisfaction budget. It fits the criteria." "Good," Patricia said, turning back to Thomas. "Mr. Wilson, it seems we may have found a path forward. Would you be willing to help us design this pilot program? Your expertise would be invaluable." Thomas considered the offer. It would require time and energy he barely had to spare. But it also represented an opportunity to create lasting change that would extend beyond his own airline. "I'm willing," he said finally. "On one condition." "Which is?" Patricia asked. "That if the pilot program shows positive results, you commit to implementing it company-wide within 6 months. No delays, no excuses." The executives exchanged glances again, having a silent conversation with their eyes. Eventually, Patricia nodded. "If the data supports it, we'll make it happen. You have my word." Thomas extended his hand across the table. "Then we have a deal." As the meeting wrapped up, Thomas found himself alone with Ms. Reynolds in the hallway, waiting for the elevator. The awkward silence stretched between them until she finally spoke. "Your children," she said hesitantly. "How are they doing?" "They're resilient," Thomas replied. "But that doesn't make what happened okay." "No, it doesn't," she agreed. "I've been trying to figure out how to apologize to them, if that would be appropriate." Thomas considered this. "An apology might help you feel better, but I'm not sure it would help them. What would help is knowing that what happened to them won't happen to someone else's children." The elevator arrived with a soft ding. As they stepped inside, Ms. Reynolds nodded. "That's what I want too. To make sure I never make anyone feel the way I made your kids feel." "That's a good start," Thomas said as the doors closed. "But there's something else you should understand." "What's that?" "This isn't just about making people feel welcome in first class. It's about recognizing the humanity in everyone, regardless of where they're sitting on the plane. Thomas looked at her directly. Every passenger deserves respect. The grandmother in economy with her life savings in a plastic bag. The teenager, flying standby to get to college. The family who saved for years for one vacation. They all matter just as much as the business traveler in the expensive suit. Ms. Reynolds was quiet for a moment. You know, in training they tell us that first-class passengers are our priority because they pay more. That's the business model. I know, Thomas said. I run an airline. But there's a difference between providing premium service and treating people like they have different levels of human value. The elevator reached the ground floor and opened to the busy lobby. Mr. Wilson, Ms. Reynolds said as they stepped out. Thank you. Thomas looked at her questioningly. For not demanding my job, she explained. For giving me a chance to learn and change instead. Don't thank me yet, Thomas replied. The real work is just beginning. It's easier to lose a job than to confront your own biases. What I'm asking of you is actually the harder path. I'm ready, she said with unexpected firmness. I need to do this. For myself as much as for your children or anyone else. Thomas studied her face, seeing genuine determination there. Then I look forward to working with you on this pilot program, Ms. Reynolds. Linda, she corrected him. Please call me Linda. Linda, Thomas agreed. And I'm Thomas. As they parted ways in the lobby, Thomas felt cautiously optimistic. The HOA Diaries meeting had gone better than he'd anticipated. There was a concrete plan in place and, surprisingly, some of the strongest support had come from Linda herself. Thomas pulled out his phone to call Denise as he walked to his car. She answered on the second ring. How did it go? She asked immediately. Better than expected, Thomas told her, recounting the meeting and the agreement to create a pilot program. And the flight attendant? Denise pressed. Was she defensive? Just the opposite, Thomas said, still somewhat surprised himself. She owned up to her actions completely, no excuses, and she volunteered to be part of the solution. Denise sounded skeptical. People will say anything when their job is on the line. Maybe, Thomas conceded. But I think there's more to it than that. She seemed genuinely affected by what happened, like it made her question things about herself that she'd never questioned before. Well, I hope you're right, Denise said. But I'll believe it when I see the results. Fair enough, Thomas agreed. How are the kids doing? Have you talked to them today? Just got off the phone with them before you called, Denise said, her voice warming. They're having a blast with my parents. Dad took them fishing this morning and Mom's teaching them her secret peach cobbler recipe this afternoon. Thomas smiled, picturing his children in his in-laws' cozy kitchen, dusted with flour and laughing. Good. They deserve some carefree time. They mentioned the flight home, Denise added, her tone more serious. Zion asked if they'll have any trouble with their seats this time. Thomas sighed. This is exactly why we need to fix these problems. Kids shouldn't have to worry about whether they'll be treated fairly because of how they look. No, they shouldn't, Denise agreed softly. But we both know that's not the world we live in. Not yet, anyway. We're working on it, Thomas said, reaching his car. One airline at a time if necessary. After saying goodbye to Denise, Thomas sat in his car for a moment, reflecting on the day's events. He thought about Linda Reynolds and her unexpected willingness to change. He thought about his children and the world they were growing up in, better in some ways than the one he'd grown up in, but still deeply flawed. Change was possible. He had to believe that, not just because he was working to create it, but because he'd seen it happen, in his own life, in his industry, and even today in that conference room. It wouldn't be easy or quick. The pilot program would face resistance. Some people would participate grudgingly, going through the motions without opening their minds. Others might actively sabotage it. But some, perhaps even Linda, would embrace it genuinely. And that's how change began, not with everyone at once, but with enough people to make a difference. As Thomas started his car, his phone buzzed with a text from Zion. Grandma says hi. We're making cobbler and talking about you. She's telling us stories about when you were our age. Miss you, Dad. Thomas smiled, typing back, "Miss you too. Save me some cobbler. Love you both." Simple words, but they reminded him why all of this mattered. Why the difficult conversations and uncomfortable confrontations were worth it. He wasn't just building a better airline or even a better industry. He was trying to build a better world for his children, one where they wouldn't be judged by the color of their skin but by the content of their character, as Dr. King had dreamed so long ago. It was a dream that still hadn't fully come true. But Thomas Wilson was doing his part to make it real. One flight, one meeting, one person at a time. 3 months had passed since the incident at the airport. The summer heat had given way to the first crisp days of autumn, and the pilot program that Thomas had helped design was in its final week of evaluation. Thomas sat in his office at Summit Airlines headquarters, reviewing the preliminary data. The numbers were encouraging. Customer satisfaction scores for Linda's crew had improved by 17%. Complaints related to bias or unfair treatment had dropped to 0 for the last 6 weeks. Most importantly, crew members reported feeling more confident in their interactions with all passengers, regardless of appearance or background. "These results are even better than I expected," Thomas told Denise over lunch in his office. "If the trend holds, Patricia will have no choice but to implement the program company-wide." Denise studied the report with a critical eye. As Summit's unofficial advisor on cabin crew matters, her opinion carried significant weight. The real test will be whether these changes stick when people aren't under such close observation. "True," Thomas acknowledged, "but I think something genuine is happening here, especially with Linda. She's become one of the program's strongest advocates." "That still surprises me," Denise admitted, setting down the report. "People don't usually change that dramatically." Thomas smiled. "Sometimes, all they need is the right push. And speaking of Linda, she's coming here today. We're doing a final review before presenting to Patricia's team tomorrow." "Really?" Denise raised an eyebrow. "I'd like to meet this woman who's had such a change of heart." "You might get your chance," Thomas said. "But be nice. She's really trying." Denise gave him a look. "I'm always nice, I just don't suffer fools gladly." "She's not a fool," Thomas said quietly. "She made a mistake, recognized it, and is working to do better. That takes courage." Before Denise could respond, Thomas's assistant knocked on the door. "Mr. Wilson, Ms. Reynolds is here for your 2 o'clock. "Send her in," Thomas replied, standing up. Linda entered the office looking more confident than she had 3 months ago. She wore her uniform crisply pressed, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. She carried a tablet and a small stack of printed materials. "Thomas, good to see you," she said, then noticed Denise. "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize you had company." "Not company," Thomas corrected with a smile. "This is my wife, Denise Wilson." Linda's eyes widened slightly in recognition. "Mrs. Wilson, it's an honor to meet you. I've heard so much about your work with Summit's training programs." Denise nodded, her expression neutral as she shook Linda's hand. "Ms. Reynolds, I've heard quite a bit about you as well." A faint blush colored Linda's cheeks. "I imagine you have. Not all of it good, I'm sure." "Let's sit down," Thomas suggested, gesturing to the conference table in the corner of his office. "We have a lot to cover before tomorrow's presentation." For the next hour, they reviewed the data, refined their talking points, and discussed potential questions that might arise from Patricia's team. Linda had come prepared, with detailed notes on each crew member's experience and suggestions for improving the program going forward. "The most effective part has been the scenario workshops," she explained, showing them feedback forms from her colleagues. "Role-playing real situations forces people to confront their assumptions in a way that traditional training never did." Denise, who had been mostly quiet, finally spoke up. "What was the hardest part for you personally, Ms. Reynolds?" Linda looked up, surprised by the direct question. "The hardest part?" She considered for a moment. "Admitting to myself that I wasn't the person I thought I was. I've always prided myself on treating everyone equally. Finding out that I had these blind spots was humbling." And painful, I imagine, Denise added, her tone softening slightly. Linda nodded. Very. Especially when I started recognizing patterns in my behavior. Times when I'd been dismissive or suspicious of certain passengers without realizing why. It's not a pleasant thing to see in yourself. Thomas watched this exchange with interest. Denise was naturally protective of their family, and he knew she'd been skeptical about Linda's sincerity. But he could see her assessment shifting as Linda spoke. The twins are flying back from their grandparents this weekend, Denise said suddenly. On your airline, actually. Linda looked up sharply. Really? Which flight? Sunday afternoon, Atlanta to New York, Thomas answered. It's the same route as before. Linda nodded thoughtfully. I'm not scheduled for that flight, but... She hesitated, then continued. Would it be inappropriate if I requested to work it? I've been wanting to apologize to your children directly, but only if you think that would be okay. Thomas and Denise exchanged glances, having one of those silent conversations that long-married couples perfect. I think that might be good for everyone, Thomas finally said. If you're comfortable with it, Denise. Denise studied Linda for a long moment. If you're doing it for the right reasons, not just to ease your conscience. It's not about me, Linda assured her. It's about acknowledging what happened and showing them that people can learn and change. But if you think it would make them uncomfortable, I completely understand. Let's ask them, Denise decided, pulling out her phone. They're old enough to make that choice for themselves. While Denise stepped aside to call the twins, Thomas and Linda continued reviewing the presentation materials. A few minutes later, Denise returned. They said yes, she announced. They'd like to see you again, Linda. Linda looked both relieved and nervous. Thank you. I'll request the schedule change as soon as I leave here. As they wrapped up their meeting, Thomas walked Linda to the elevator. Tomorrow's presentation is important, he reminded her. Patricia needs to see your conviction. She will, Linda promised. This program is too important to fail. It's changed how I see my job, how I see myself. I want others to have that same opportunity. Thomas nodded, satisfied with her response. I'll see you tomorrow then. And Sunday, Linda added with a small smile. I'll make sure your children have a very different experience this time. Sunday. Afternoon arrived with clear skies and mild temperatures. Perfect flying weather. Zion and Zara Wilson stood at the gate in Atlanta's busy airport, boarding passes in hand. Unlike their previous trip, they approached the first-class line with confidence, no hesitation in their steps. First-class passengers may now board, announced the gate agent. The twins moved forward, but before they could reach the gate, they heard a familiar voice. Zion and Zara Wilson? They turned to see Ms. Reynolds approaching, her platinum blonde hair still in its tight bun. But something was different about her. Her smile seemed genuine, reaching her eyes in a way it hadn't before. Hello, Ms. Reynolds, Zara said politely, though Thomas could hear the wariness in his daughter's voice through the phone call he was on with them. I wanted to welcome you personally, Linda said. We're so glad to have you flying with us today. The twins exchanged surprised glances. Let me scan your boarding passes, Linda continued, taking their phones and quickly checking their tickets. Perfect, you're in 2A and 2B, window and aisle. Would you like to board now? Yes, please, Zion replied, still watching her cautiously. Right this way, Linda said, leading them to the jetway. As they walked, she spoke quietly. I want you both to know how sorry I am about what happened the last time you flew with us. There's no excuse for how I treated you, and I've spent these past months working to make sure nothing like that happens to any of our passengers again. The twins didn't respond immediately, processing her words. Your father has been helping us create a new training program, Linda continued. It's making a real difference. They reached the aircraft door where Alex, the younger flight attendant, from their previous flight, waited with a smile. Welcome back, he greeted them warmly. Great to see you both again. Thanks, Zara replied, her posture relaxing slightly. Let me show you to your seats, Linda offered, leading them into the first-class cabin. This time there was no confusion, no one sitting in their assigned places. The seats were waiting for them, with bottled water and headphones already set. Out? If you need anything during the flight, please don't hesitate to ask, Linda told them. Enjoy your trip home. As she walked away to greet other passengers, Zion turned to Zara. That was unexpected. Dad said she's changed, Zara reminded him, buckling her seatbelt. I guess he was right. Maybe, Zion said, still not entirely convinced. Let's see how the rest of the flight goes. Throughout the journey, Linda was the model of professionalism, treating all passengers with equal respect and warmth. She made a point of checking on the twins regularly but not intrusively, ensuring they had everything they needed without making them feel singled out. When they landed in New York, Thomas was waiting at the arrival gate. He hugged his children, tightly, having missed them during their extended stay with their grandparents. How was the flight? He asked, taking Zara's backpack to carry it for her. Good, Zion replied. Really good, actually. Ms. Reynolds was nice, Zara added. Like genuinely nice, not fake nice. Thomas smiled. I'm glad to hear that. As they walked toward baggage claim, they spotted Linda heading toward her next flight. She noticed them and gave a small wave, which the twins returned. Dad, Zion asked, as they waited for their luggage. Do you think she really changed, or is she just being nice because she knows who we are now? Thomas considered the question carefully. I think it's a bit of both, he answered honestly. Knowing who you are, who I am, certainly made her pay attention. But what she did with that attention was her choice. She could have just gone through the motions, done the minimum to keep her job. Instead, she chose to look hard at herself and make real changes. And she's helping with your training program? Zara asked. Thomas nodded. She's become one of our most effective advocates. The program is being implemented company-wide next month. Because it worked? Zion asked. Because she made it work, Thomas corrected. She took it seriously and convinced others to do the same. As they collected their bags and headed for the parking garage, Thomas reflected on the journey of the past 3 months. The incident that had started as a painful example of discrimination had transformed into something constructive, a catalyst for change that would affect thousands of travelers and employees. You know, he told his children as they reached the car. Sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best outcomes if we're willing to learn from them. Like when you fell off your bike and broke your arm when you were 10, Zara teased. Grandma told us all about that. Thomas laughed. That's not exactly what I meant, but sure. After that, I learned to wear a helmet. And Ms. Reynolds learned not to judge people by how they look, Zion added more seriously. Exactly, Thomas agreed. And now she's helping others learn that same lesson. Later that evening, as the family sat around the dinner table catching up, Denise asked the twins what they had learned from the whole experience. Zara thought for a moment. I learned that standing up for yourself doesn't always mean getting angry. Sometimes it means staying calm and letting the other person see their own mistake. Good one, Thomas nodded. Zion? I learned that people can change, Zion said slowly, but only if they want to. Ms. Reynolds wanted to change when she realized she was wrong. That's very insightful, Denise said, squeezing her son's hand. Most people get defensive when they're called out. It takes real character to accept criticism and grow from it. What about you, Dad? Zara asked. What did you learn? Thomas considered the question. I learned that creating change takes more than pointing out problems. It takes offering solutions and being willing to do the hard work of implementing them. Is that why you spent so much time on this training program? Zion asked. Even though you're already super busy running your own airline? Thomas nodded. Some things are worth the extra effort. Making air travel more equitable for everyone is one of those things. Plus, Denise added with a smile, your father never could resist a challenge. As the conversation moved on to other topics, the twins' adventures with their grandparents, plans for the upcoming school year, a potential family vacation, Thomas felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The incident that had once filled him with anger and disappointment had been transformed into something positive. The next morning, Thomas received an email from Patricia Clark, confirming that the training program would be implemented across all crews, starting the following month. Attached was a note from Linda. Thomas, thank you for the opportunity to be part of this program. Meeting your children again yesterday reminded me why this work matters. They're extraordinary young people, and no one should ever make them feel unwelcome because of how they look. I'm committed to continuing this work long after the spotlight has moved on. Linda. Thomas forwarded the email to Denise with a simple comment. I think she means it. Denise's reply came a few minutes later. I think so too. Sometimes people surprise you in the best possible way. Thomas smiled as he closed his laptop. In an industry that moved millions of people around the world every day, changing one person's perspective might seem insignificant. But that one person could influence countless others. Linda would interact with hundreds of passengers each week, treating each one with the dignity and respect they deserved. She would train other flight attendants to do the same. Those flight attendants would influence their colleagues. Change rippled outward, touching lives in ways that couldn't always be measured, but were no less real for being invisible. And it had all started with two teenagers in hoodies being told they didn't belong in first class. Thomas made a mental note to tell the twins this story again when they were older, to help them understand that standing up for what's right doesn't always mean winning a dramatic victory in the moment. Sometimes it means planting seeds of change that grow slowly but surely, transforming the landscape one mind at a time. For now, though, he was simply grateful to have his family back together, and to know that the next time his children boarded a plane, any plane, they were a little more likely to be seen for who they truly were, not judged by assumptions about where they belonged. And in the end, wasn't that what everyone deserved? To be seen, to be welcomed, to be treated with dignity and respect. It seemed like such a simple thing, and yet it required constant vigilance, constant growth, constant willingness to examine one's own biases and assumptions. The work wasn't finished. It might never be truly finished. But Thomas Wilson was committed to continuing it, one flight, one conversation, one changed mind at a time. And now he knew so was Linda Reynolds. That perhaps was the most unexpected outcome of all, finding an ally in the person who had once been the problem. Life was full of such surprises, Thomas reflected, as he closed his office door and headed home to his family. And that was what made the journey worthwhile.